Here's a map of a portion of Dallas, Texas, and guess what we're counting here? It's churches that are part of the Southern Baptist Convention. Just in this one part of town, there are 70 SBC churches. The SBC has over 47,000 congregations, which have a combined 3.6 million people in weekly attendance. Compare that to the only 19,495 incorporated cities, villages, and towns in the U.S. So what do these churches believe and teach? Well, they tell you in their statement of faith called the Baptist Faith and Message. This latest edition came out in 2000 and was the culmination of a fight in the SBC for control called the Conservative Resurgence. Yes, the conservatives won, and the SBC is more conservative than it was in the past, when in 1971 their position called for abortion to be legal in cases like the mother's mental health being damaged or severe fetal deformity. The most liberal churches left to form a denomination called Alliance of Baptists in 1987, and another group called Cooperative Baptist Fellowship left in 2002. Today, the SBC affirms the Bible as being without error and has two ordinances, baptism of believers and the Lord's Supper. Baptism is not required for salvation, and the Lord's Supper is viewed as symbolic. The cup normally has grape juice. Most churches have communion between monthly and quarterly. They teach the necessity of being born again or saved by grace through faith alone. The majority of the SBC is not Calvinist, but there is a good-sized minority that are, including many of the influential voices at SBC seminaries. However, the vast majority of SBC-aligned churches affirm once saved, always saved. The SBC is mostly not charismatic, but many churches are not cessationist either. The main end times view of the SBC in the past was pre-tribulation, rapture, premillennial, but today there is more variety and churches don't have to believe the same way on this. The SBC does enforce its position of no same-sex marriage and not being affirming of the LGBT movement. If a church does become affirming, the SBC kicks them out. Music and worship style can vary a lot. There are SBC megachurches that have praise bands, and there are also congregations that stick to the hymnal. Many SBC churches teach total abstinence from alcohol. Southern Baptists have their strongest presence in the U.S. South, and so does another group of Baptists with some different beliefs, the Primitive Baptists. Click here for the 2-minute video on Primitive Baptists, or if you want to watch a more in-depth video on the Southern Baptist Convention, click here. Some denominations require members to believe the same things on a lot of issues, but here's one where there's a lot of room to disagree. Calvinist or Provisionist or Arminian? That's fine, you can still be apart. Believe in evolution or creation without evolution? Either is fine. As a member, you want your infants to be baptized? That's okay. Want to have your kids wait to make a profession before baptism? That's okay too. Now, you might expect this to be a theologically liberal denomination because this much permission on issues is something that isn't seen in a lot of evangelical denominations, but we are in fact talking about the Evangelical Covenant Church. They teach the necessity of a new birth, a conversion in which a person puts their faith in Jesus Christ and receives eternal life. Most congregations offer confirmation classes, and they have open communion. They believe the Bible is perfect, but most congregations don't use the words inerrant or infallible to describe it. Here's some other areas they allow room for disagreement. You can affirm penal substitutionary atonement or disagree with it. You can be opposed to drinking alcohol, or you can enjoy a beer. You can believe in a future millennium or be amillennial. They are continuationist, meaning they believe all the spiritual gifts still exist, but churches are not charismatic in practice. Women are ordained to ministry, and they oppose abortion and same-sex marriage. They have over 750 churches with over 200,000 people in weekly attendance, and one well-known congregation is Life Church, previously known as lifechurch.tv. Their origin is in Lutherans who came to America from Sweden and dropped the Lutheran confessions due to a movement called Pietism, which tends to make Lutherans into evangelicals of some kind. The Evangelical Covenant Church has expelled some churches in recent years that became affirming of LGBT practices. In contrast, one of the most pro-LGBT denominations in the world is the Metropolitan Community Churches, which were founded as a denomination for the gay community. Click here to learn about them in 2 minutes, or for a more detailed look at the Evangelical Covenant Church, click here.
Hey guys, today I'm going to introduce you to the Church Compass. It's like the political compass, but not political and for church. I invented it in high school, mostly while doodling on my homework instead of, doing my homework, because I had just converted to Christianity and I was looking at all the different kinds of churches, all the different denominations. I noticed some churches were very liberal, some were very conservative, Some were very traditional, and some were very anti-traditional. And in this context, liberal and conservative don't necessarily mean anything political. Theologically liberal just means they're less strict about the beliefs of their religion, and conservative means they're more strict about their beliefs. And high church is what we call churches where the church itself and its traditions has more authority. And low church means it's less about the church and tradition and more about your own personal relationship with God and personal interpretation of the Bible. So I noticed you could put all the major Christian traditions on a scale from low church to high church. Approximately, there is some overlap, but you will find liberals and conservatives within all of these branches. So it's not like Methodists are liberal and Baptists are conservative. You'll really find both conservatives and liberals within both of those traditions, within all of them. So really the y-axis determines what branch of Christianity you'll be part of, and the x-axis determines how liberal or conservative you'll be within that branch. And here's how I ranked them. So all the churches above this line practice infant baptism, whereas the churches below this line, Baptists and non-denominationals, well really non-denominationals are just Baptists but with a smoke machine, Baptists with a lowercase b, those churches below this line do not practice infant baptism because they think being a Christian is purely a personal individual choice. And that makes sense, being more low church, it's more about a personal relationship. Whereas above this line, infant baptism shows that being a Christian isn't purely a personal decision, but also being part of the broader family of God, being part of the church. So you can see why practicing infant baptism makes a church a bit more high church than a church that does not practice infant baptism. So all the churches above this line believe that Jesus Christ is physically present in the Lord's Supper. Now, it's not like the churches below this line think the Lord's Supper is just a symbol. All the churches between these two lines, the ones that practice infant baptism but don't believe Jesus is physically present in the Lord's Supper, still would affirm a kind of spiritual real presence of Christ in the Lord's Supper. So we're talking Presbyterians, Methodists, Congregationalists. All of them still do affirm that we really receive the body and blood of Christ, but it's more of a spiritual thing. They wouldn't say the bread and wine actually change. But generally speaking, the churches above this line believe in either transubstantiation or physical real presence or consubstantiation, whatever you want to call it. They believe that the presence of Christ in the Lord's Supper is something physical. I've heard some Lutherans try and explain that their view isn't exactly physical real presence, but for simplicity's sake, we're going to say that all the churches above this line, Lutherans, most Anglicans, Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and I'm going to include the Oriental Orthodox later, just it would crowd out the chart too much if I include them now. They all believe Christ is physically present in the Lord's Supper. And then all the churches above this line believe in apostolic succession, meaning they believe their church is the one true church with direct continuity to the apostles. That means their priests were ordained by priests who were ordained by priests all the way going back to the apostles, and that's where their church gets its legitimacy from. So the apostolic succession churches are mainly just the Catholic churches, the Orthodox churches, and there's some Anglicans above this line. Anglicans have a very broad range, which I'm going to get into a bit later. So the reason the Orthodox are on the top is because they're the most strict about claiming to be the one true church. If you go into an Orthodox church, you'll find icons of the saints plastered all over the walls. What that communicates is that this is the church with rootedness in the past. This is the church with direct continuity to the apostles. Whether or not you agree with that, that's what the Orthodox are trying to communicate. And that's why they're the most, tradition-centered branch of Christianity. They're all about keeping everything the same, keeping the same practices alive, the practices that they claim go all the way back to the apostles. Now, Catholics also do claim to be the one true church, but for Catholics, it's more about the church's authority than the church's rootedness in tradition. So that's why Catholics are a little bit more open to changing things than the Orthodox are, and Catholics are a little bit more open-minded to other types of Christians like Protestants, especially after the Second Vatican Council. Now, for Anglicans, it's weird, because some Anglicans seem more Catholic and some seem more Protestant. The reason for this is the Anglican Church kind of developed out of a struggle between Catholics and Protestants, and you can kind of see the remnants of that struggle today in Anglicanism. So that's why Anglicanism has such a broad range. Now, Lutherans are the only church fully between these two lines where they have a very, very high view of the sacraments, meaning baptism and the Lord's Supper, a more Catholic-style view of the sacraments, but they have a more Protestant view of the church, where they don't think any one institution or organization is the one true church. church. So they're Protestant in some way when it comes to salvation, how justification works, but they have a Catholic-sounding view of the sacraments. Of course, they would say it's not a Catholic view, but sometimes Lutherans refer to themselves as evangelical Catholics for this reason. So now we get to our Presbyterians. Traditional Presbyterian churches, they look a lot simpler because the Reformation did simplify church architecture because it was less about the church. It's less high church and more about your own personal relationship with God, but not nearly as low church as a lot of modern evangelical churches. When I say traditional Presbyterian churches look beautiful like this, I mean traditional Presbyterian churches, because modern church architecture is ugly all across the board, because ugliness is one of the spiritual poisons of modernity, and I think the church needs to be a place of beauty to fight that. Methodists and Congregationalists are in a similar place to Presbyterians. There's a lot of overlap. I would say Methodists and Congregationalists, especially Congregationalists, are a bit more low church than Presbyterians because they didn't exactly come from the Reformation itself. They came mostly from the Great Awakening and maybe the Puritan era, which came a bit after the Reformation, where people were shifting in an even more low church direction, even more away from the traditional religious institutions and more towards a personal relationship. Presbyterian and Congregationalist, those titles refer to the structure of the church government, and by definition, Congregationalist is a less authoritative, traditional, structured way to govern the church. Congregationalism has basically every church act as sort of an independent body. But then when we get lower than that, we get our Baptists. And for Baptist churches, the church really just functions as a fellowship of individual believers. So that's why there's not much of an emphasis on the church as an institution. There's emphasis on the Bible and your personal salvation. That's where the emphasis lies. But Baptist churches are still formal. And that's the only real thing that differentiates them from non-denominationals. In non-denominational churches, there's basically no formality, no sacredness, no ritual, because they sort of think that all gets in the way of your personal relationship with God. They seem to want church to be as casual as possible. Okay, now let's put some people on the compass. John MacArthur is an example of a very conservative Baptist. R.C. Sproul is a conservative Presbyterian. Tim Keller is also Presbyterian, but a lot less conservative. C.S. Lewis is really in the center of the compass, which is why people of all different Christian traditions have appreciated him, because he's not too far from anyone. Jordan Cooper is a pretty conservative Lutheran. Doug Wilson is a very conservative Presbyterian, but he's a lot more high church than some others. Trent Horn's a conservative Catholic YouTuber. Bishop Robert Barron's a famous Catholic YouTuber and bishop. Richard Rohr is an example of a very liberal Catholic. I'd say he's liberal to the point of denying the essentials of Christianity. And there are even liberal Orthodox people. David Bentley Hart is in the Orthodox tradition, and he wrote a book advocating universalism, which is basically saying everyone's going to make it to heaven eventually, no matter what. But generally speaking, most Orthodox people are very conservative. So an example of a famous Orthodox priest is Father Josiah Trenum. He's a YouTuber and stuff. And not all Baptists are conservative either. Gavin Ortland still leans pretty conservative, but he's a lot less conservative than someone like John MacArthur, and I'm personally a very huge fan of Gavin Ortland. And there are examples of very liberal Baptists, at least theologically liberal. The most famous example is, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was a Baptist minister, but he was very theologically liberal. I mean, that's not an insult because most of the Founding Fathers were also very theologically liberal. And most non-denominational megachurch pastors like Joel Osteen would fall somewhere around here. So now I'm going to explain what theologically liberal and theologically conservative really mean. So it's not perfect because there's a lot of factors, but generally everyone to the left of this line is at least okay with people believing in evolution, or at least not being strictly young earth creationist. Everyone to the left of this line is okay with female pastors. Everyone to the left of this line is LGBTQ affirming in the church. And this line is where you get into actual heresy, meaning denying the essentials of the faith, like some people denying the Trinity or denying the resurrection of Christ or denying that Jesus is God. So now I'm going to go over the specific Presbyterian denominations because I'm Presbyterian and those are the ones I know about. I'd love to do it for all of them, but I simply don't know enough, so maybe if you could give me some information, maybe I could make a part 2 about this. But yeah, the different specific denominations within these traditions are often divided from liberal to conservative, splitting over issues like gay marriage or women's ordination. So the biggest and the mainline Presbyterian denomination is, of course, the PCUSA, and it has the broadest range from liberal to conservative. This is my denomination, so I'd probably be right over here at the very conservative end of the PCUSA. We also have some radically liberal people in the PCUSA who, don't believe the resurrection was a literal thing, and we also have people that are very similar to PCA, because there is a little bit of overlap. So the PCA is the second biggest denomination. It is a conservative offshoot denomination. It also has a pretty big range, but generally it's less traditional than the PCUSA. It looks a lot more contemporary. They don't value the sacraments quite as much, but there is always overlap between all of these. Then there's ECO, and I really like ECO because ECO is basically just the conservative slice of the PCUSA that kind of split off, and I do go to an ECO church a lot of the time when I'm at school instead of home. So yeah, ECO is pretty cool. Then you have the EPC, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, which is very diverse in terms of style. You'll have some very high church EPC churches and some very low church and even kind of charismatic EPC churches. Then you have the OPC, which is a very small and very conservative denomination, and the reason for this is they're very retreatist and isolationist. They basically just focus on having pure doctrines, and they don't want to unify with anyone else who doesn't. Then there's the RPCNA, a very, very small and old denomination that is extremely strict about adhering to not just all the Reformed beliefs, but all the Reformed traditions as well, and that's why they're a bit more traditional than the OPC. Now I'm going to go over the things I didn't go over before. The Oriental Orthodox churches are probably up here, very similar to Orthodox, but not quite as strict, always about being the one true church. The Pentecostals would probably be down here, very unstructured, low church approach, and they also don't do infant baptism, so they're overlapping the Baptists and non-denominationals. The Nazarene Holiness churches are probably here in between the Methodists and Pentecostals, which makes sense because their history is them arising out of the Methodist tradition, and then the Pentecostals arose out of them, so it makes sense for them to be in between. And if you're wondering where I'm going to put the Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses or Seventh-day Adventists or Church of Christ, those aren't branches of historic Christianity, so they wouldn't go on here. They're not branches of the Christian family tree. They were started from scratch, claiming to be rebuilding the Christianity that had been lost for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it wouldn't make sense to put them on a graph of Christian branches. Alright guys, that's about it for this video. If you have some corrections or comments, I'd love to hear about it in the comments section. If you guys want me to do a part 2 where I talk about other things, I will. But for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later.